Mike Hamilton. I'm with Critical Informatics. I have been a policy advisor to the state. I've been the CISO for the city of Seattle. I've been the managing consultant for VeriSign, where I worked with Vern and Fred. Now we're all in with the company. We do managed detection and response, and that might come out as one of the ways to manage risk, but I want to be pretty objective about this. So you guys introduce yourselves. Vern?
Hi, I'm Vern Cole. I work for Perkins Coie. I'm the information security officer there. Like Mike said, that's an international law firm. Pretty interesting place to work. Security at a law firm is a little bit different. And then working with Mike was even more different. And Fred. Where's Fred? Fred's back there. There he is.
Hi, I'm Glenn Joyner. I'm the CISO at Milliman. We're a global actuarial consulting firm based in Seattle. If you don't know what an actuary is, we typically work with insurance companies, financial institutions, take a look at large data sets to help use predictive analytics and other tools to help people make risk decisions. So I work in risk in an organization that studies and consults risk for others. Very interesting.
Oh, there it is. It's green. Testing. Good afternoon. My name is Sean Murphy. I work at Premera Blue Cross up in Mount Lake Terrace, a little north of here. I've been there a little under 3 years now. I've worked at Premera Blue Cross in healthcare insurance. So all the good stuff that you have to contend with data, healthcare data, HIPAA as a regulatory framework. My background is in healthcare, information security, going all the way back to retiring from the Air Force in 2010. And how I got started in information security had to do with plugging in medical devices on the warfighters network. So I don't know that we'll touch on it today, but I have some battle scars from doing risk management of medical devices, not only in a healthcare setting and pure information security, but also when it's ratcheted up to kind of plugging them into the same network that, and you might not believe me when I tell you this, but when we plug in our F-16s, when they come back into the hangar, some of that data is on the same network. So that's my background.
Hi, my name is Matt Morton. I work for the Seattle Public Schools. I've been there about 19 years in various roles and capacities. I'm currently information security architect, something, for a relatively new cybersecurity team at Seattle Schools. The other half of it is April Murdoch, who's over there. So if she throws a beer can at me, there's probably a reason for it, I guess I would say. So some of my perspective has been, bringing things up, some, elements of a mature system up for the first time, and just kind of a boilerplate. I did finish my MS recently. It's in information security, but it did a bunch of risk in it. So that's, that was sort of the specialty I was able to choose in it.
Okay, good to go. So let me just poll the room. How many folks in the room are information security people? Okay, and how many are more risk management, more of a fiduciary responsibility, dealing with insurance and things like that? Not so many. Okay, so sounds like information security is kind of a common language for us. Way back in the 20th century, everybody was tasked in information security with keeping bad guys out of the network, and that was really the thing. Prevent things from happening. This should not happen. And I think the realization has hit all of us. It's certainly positioned this way in the news a lot. You guys know I go through a lot of news. The conversation has really changed around information security, and it's not so much anymore prevent these things from happening. We want you to prevent these things from happening. We need to manage the risk, and we need to limit the damage from these things that we know will happen. And that conversation now is really starting to take root. So I think this is a good thing for us all to discuss how you go about not only assessing risk, but how you deal with it and how you report it up to management and how you use that to your advantage. This can be used as a way to drive budget for your corrective actions. When you are making a fiduciary argument, not, ooh, cyber scary bad guy, here's our dollar amount of liability. And so we're going to try to focus this discussion around that. we're going to try and keep focused on outcomes here that cost money. And I brief a lot of elected officials, and I can tell you that you really need to package things very simply when you're talking to folks like that. And so we'll get to this, but I like to use 3 bad outcomes as the way to frame the discussion around risk, right? The avoidance of these bad outcomes, each of which costs money. Did anybody pick up that risk paper and read it, the primer paper that we sent out? Okay, if you didn't, it's back there. That paper was written specifically around managing risk on vulnerabilities that you need to detect. Everybody's got a regulatory, for the most part, everybody has a regulatory requirement to manage vulnerabilities. When you find them, there's a certain likelihood that they can be exploited to cause a bad outcome. Managing risk around that is kind of the way information security has been. And now it's sometimes more alignment with a framework, right? So the NIST cybersecurity framework, or if you decide to, you know, Sean's got to be compliant with HIPAA, as do we. We're a HIPAA business associate. So we'll touch back on that risk paper a little bit. It has applicability. That's not the only way that this is done. Let's get going. Anybody see what's going on with Atlanta? Yeah. There's a story out today, and what they said was Atlanta is not managing their risk appropriately. And so the way I take that to mean is they could have lessened the impact term of the risk expression by detecting and expunging a small compromise first before it burned their damn house down. Okay? And I'm using that to kind of frame this. If you think about this expression for risk, and I know I'm doing all the talking here, and I'm going to get these guys to talk in a minute. If you look at the expression for risk, it's threat probability multiplied by impact, right? Okay, well, there's 2 terms there that you're going to try and affect. So we'll come back to that, but that first one, that likelihood term, affecting that through preventive controls, and the impact term, affecting that through effective detection and response. It's okay to get a little fire. Don't let it burn the house down, right? So let's go back to this. So panel, which one of the discussions do you have? You were all chiefs of information security or work on an information security team in some kind of risk management capacity. Are you told to keep the bad guys out of the network, or are you having conversations about minimizing loss and impact? Vern?
It's a little bit of both, but I'm also trying to turn that conversation where I think it's a law firm, right? So they have a different view of things. Excuse me. But when you start having those conversations to say, we can't really keep all the bad guys out. And then you get a nation state attack that starts to look for law firms. I don't know if you've seen some of the headlines around it. I love the headlines with law firms because it helps my job, makes my job much easier to come up and say, we don't want to do this. We don't want to be, as Mike pointed out, avoid those bad outcomes. So when you see the nation state attacks hit law firms, I can go to the management team and say, we can detect when they get in. That's where we want to be. Detecting when they get in. Keeping them out is going to be really, really hard. They have to be right once. We have to be right all the time.
I'm gonna echo what Vern said. It's a bit of both. So certainly we're having a conversation always continually on protect the enterprise. I have conversations with my board regularly. They will say they're familiar with the risks to the business, and what we need to understand in information security is this is a wonderful time to be in this position, whatever role you're in information security, because you're being integrated into the risk evaluation of the whole organization, right? There are risks to your company just being in business. Your company's worried about, can we make payroll? There are other risks that are material to whether they're in business tomorrow. But what's happening for the board is information security because of the way business is transacted daily, because of the information you have, because of whether you're point of sale or what. And electronically, now they have to factor that into some of the risk decisions they're doing. So my board, and probably all of your boards and the people that we report to, are intimately familiar with risk. So we want to have that conversation of what we're doing to manage the risk, reduce it, lower it. They completely understand that stuff will happen, and you'd be in a bad position if you said, I can stop everything. So you have to engage that conversation from, okay, what are we doing to manage this risk? And to what Vern said, it's looking to, we look to companies similar to us because they want to know, what are other people like us doing? How have people responded? Have you done your job to understand how this happened? Can you learn from how this happened, the mechanics of where it came, to apply that to our prevention strategy? We know, and I'm not going to sell that we're 100% going to be 100% successful in prevention. The only way to do that would be to turn everything off. But that also carries a risk of not being in business. I take that to an extreme, but that's a very real conversation, right? So we know we have to accept some risk of being in business. We're going to have to invest in protection, but we're also going to have to be really good at managing the risks that we have to be aware of and prevent and present to them. Talked a little bit over, but hand it shot.
So I want to spend a little time with this just for a second. Maybe I'll talk a little bit over too, but I'll try not to, because yeah, these answers are perfect, and I would probably do just as well just to say ditto and move on. But going back to what Mike opened up with about like how we're looking at risk management, so I'll color this in with a healthcare slant. Within the security profession and within healthcare, we comforted ourselves by thinking that it's insider threat all the time. It's a lost laptop. It's somebody inadvertently sending off an email with 500 or more patient records in it, and by and large that was the threat to healthcare going back about 5 years. It's still a majority threat, whether it's an internal person in the organization or it's a third party that you're doing business with. Somebody does something with full credentials wrong, and you've got an incident. But it has pivoted towards the nation states, the organized crime, and hacktivists. And actually, going back a step, definitely with nation states, they see the critical infrastructure in healthcare as a target. And I was just at an event with Kevin Mandia from Mandiant or FireEye, and he made the comment about healthcare being fair game in his mind. And I question that, because in the real military, we're Geneva Convention, we got a big red cross on our buildings. We're not fair game. But in cybersecurity, healthcare is a fair game target for the adversary. So those things have changed in healthcare over the last 5 years. I've watched that happen in real time. Going into the Atlanta discussion, what also is real poignant about what they're going through is the disruptive nature of these attacks. And sometimes it's not just about the ransom or the bounty, it's shutting down a critical infrastructure. Atlanta is worried about the fact that they can't collect money on parking tickets, and they can't fill potholes, and they can't do the city's business because their computers don't work. And so when you think about the kind of the magnitude of that disruption going on and on and on, and then you extrapolate that into a healthcare environment, I'm particularly worried when you get a ransomware attack and you start having to divert people from your ER. You can't take care of patients that are already embedded in your facility, because we have such a reliance on embedded medical devices, networked medical devices, all kind of different diagnostic and therapeutic tools that are keeping people safe and alive. And with an attack like this, it could be just that simple, that for the next week, we can't do anything but manual patient care. We can't do the productivity levels that the community is used to. So those are really scary propositions that are, happening right in front of us. So from a risk management perspective, those are the kind of conversations you start to have. Again, I go back to everything you've heard so far is exactly the same thing I would say. We do both when it comes to doing risk management. Where I would color it a little differently too is just to add something to the discussion. I almost ask the question, like, what environment are you talking about? Because I have multiple environments that I'm trying to keep the bad guys out of. And candidly, my conversation with the board is some of them I don't really care if they get in or not. I mean, I want to, my effort in risk management is to first inventory where I have the data that I care about. So where are the crown jewels? Where are the most important assets? And I'll have other environments that do computing that I really don't care about. and the presumption of breach, whatever you call that philosophy that you just acknowledge that there's probably somebody in there, drives some really good behavior on the risk management side too, because things like you can go in, you don't trust any endpoint that ever attaches to your system. So you start to push for multi-factor authentication, VDI sessions. You start to make sure that that data never lives on an endpoint, because anything that gets into whatever environment it is, whether it's cloud, on-prem, colo kind of setups, shadow IT, no matter what that scenario is, I don't trust the person getting in it anyway. So I've got the protections that the data never moves to where that endpoint is. And then there's some parts of the environment where I've got systems that do important functions, but the data is not really sensitive. It's not crippling to the business. So I tier my architecture around, that level of protection. So again, I go back to, we do both, keeping the bad guys out, but also kind of assuming that they're going to get in. And that's the kind of discussions that we have to kind of be one step ahead.
Thanks. For me, the question goes to the same old problem that I think we all have in the, are we fighting fires today, or are we going to get ahead of the problem and that's how I align this question. I think that, and I think we've seen trying to put to apply risk management to a problem allows you to sell it to different executives when you're sort of scattershotting your appeal or the sales job, and you want it to get into everybody. And when you're picking multiple disciplines, that helps you a lot. And I guess the thing I would say on Atlanta, as I think through what would happen, at Seattle schools if we had that problem, and first we think through, the obvious technical stuff. Are we patching? Yes, we're patching. We think we're, ahead of the basics there. But I ask myself, and I don't really want to solve this problem, is how does a public entity pay the bill? Public entities have all sorts of rules, appropriately so, to make sure that when we buy something, we're buying it from the right vendor. We've gone through the proper process to make sure we're not buying it from somebody's cousin and all that stuff. How do you do a PO in a government organization to pay off a ransom? There's no budget code I hope not, in our financial system to do that. And I think that is and you know what? It's probably good that there isn't. But that is a kind of thing that I can imagine can hold off decision-making and reaction time in a municipality, is what I can imagine.
Okay. All right. We have 2 hours for this, right? Maybe not. I'm going to have to start really managing this. Okay. So risk is all about threat, the likelihood of a threat, and the impact that would create. So let's jump right into that. So when I think about threats, and I'm packaging things for elected officials or for C-level executives, they don't want to hear about buffer overflow. They don't care about SQL injection, right? They want to hear about things like, gross negligence and class action suits. But packaging things in terms of outcomes that you can put financial bounds around. So what I like to use is unauthorized disclosure of protected information, theft and extortion, or service disruption. And you can fairly put things into those three buckets. There's hybrids, right? I'm going to disrupt your services for the purpose of extorting you. When you guys, and at this point, I'm going to ask anybody to raise their hand that wants to respond to this, just in case we all don't want to talk to these questions. What do you guys use for a threat taxonomy?
So I talk with lawyers.
You gotta really dumb that down.
They want to see things in
Lawyers
very
in the room.
simple terms, right? And when you start talking language with an attorney, they have their own language. We all have our own language that we want to talk to, but I tend to use high, medium, and low, and then go to some of the potential outcomes. Law firms are a trust-based organization, so having the trust in our organization compromised, even if we just lose a copy of data, that starts to call things like intellectual property and those types of information that we have into question. Do I want this law firm to have this information? That can have a pretty substantial impact on how we go about doing our business.
So you're saying a loss of trust is a threat to you.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Makes sense.
Were we raising hands or just going next? That's fine.
Yeah.
Whatever.
It's a new form of raising hands.
Excellent. Okay. No, so we're in professional services as well. We rely on, we rely on clients trusting us with information. So absolutely. When I'm talking with executives, I don't use high, medium, low. I think one thing you can condition yourself is your trusted professionals. What an executive wants to know is, what is the risk? Have you gone through what this risk is, and what's the proposed solution? They really want to be presented with solutions.
Options.
What I find and what I'd caution, this is just my personal beef with the industry. I always caution on, the value, getting a PONEMON report and saying, yeah, here's a survey that says the value of a record is this, multiplying that by records and coming with this $8 billion number to your board, because that's just kind of crazy. I think one of the challenges I have, and I have to be very cautious, and we all should be, is how you digest that information that you're going to present up of the cost of a risk. Because the stuff that gets reported out, just bear this in mind. This is, again, I'm going to go off on my own and I'm not affiliate. This is my own personal opinion. The stuff that's reported out, there are regulatory frameworks that require people to report breaches. I'm going to venture to say that people who have breaches that don't have a requirement to report under a regulation are probably not reporting them. So the things that tend to hit the paper are the kind of, we call them in the insurance industry, the tail events, the ones that are in the catastrophic side. So I think just as you think about these conversations, it's tempting to take the latest report that somebody, a CIO or somebody might send you and say, hey, what do you think of this? Oh my God, we've got a 15 million exposure, 100 million exposure. Apply a little common sense and think about, again, this is the conversation on, we need to think, what else is happening? There are a lot of events that are unreported that can lead to these. And that's an important, factor, Atlanta being one of them. One little thing can manifest into a much bigger incident. But again, when I talk to the board, it's not high, medium, low. It's really, how can this impact the business? What are our potential solutions? And try to have a very reasonable framework of, there's sensationalistic stuff, and then there's other stuff that isn't being reported. Think through that as you're reporting. And then the other piece that I would just add from at least my industry and probably yours is bringing Target in as an example may make sense if you're in the retail industry. If you're in a consulting industry, that probably doesn't make sense and hold weight with your board because it's so completely not in line with your business model. So you have to do that. You have to do that job of thinking through, what kind of industry are we in? What's happening in there? And extract those examples, because that's what will get, that's what will at least trigger that conversation more of, hey, we don't want to be like them because our reputation might be at stake. What can we do to protect this? I'll stop there.
So, Sean, you were the one that pointed out that there is an ISO standard for threats. And I know I've read one of these a long time ago, and I wasn't going to cough up the money to buy this one. But the things that are in there are the threat of an error of omission and the threat of a malicious act by an insider and things like this that are a little harder to wrap your head around. What do you use when you're thinking about threats that you would like to avoid?
Yeah, I mean, I won't go so far as to say that we regurgitate that document. It's a little more close to home. I literally have a matrix that I use in front of the board that has an X and Y axis that go to what kind of controls we have in place based on the threat. If it's high, if we got good controls or where we don't, measure it against basically how likely the threat actor is to accomplish it. So it boils down to like things that I really worry about. It's kind of the answer, like what keeps you up at night. So it's, malware inserts, the drive-by scannings that, you see on a daily basis, things like ransomware attacks, or the insider threat, third party, activity that something goes wrong there. So, and then I kind of outline from there. And then those come out to be bubbles, which, expand or contrast based on how much that threat is accelerating in my environment. And like one that I don't think any of you guys would probably have in your environment that I do is the proliferation of data. We're a healthcare insurance company that has spent the last couple decades accumulating a lot of data to run analytics to help patient care at the end of the day. And having a good life cycle management for your data is really, really important. And, that's something the organization is working through. But I see it as a potential risk because my surface area is really, really big. And it's a nice little target for the adversary. So we've been reducing that over time. And that bubble that I'm talking about has been shrinking and shrinking. But that's a threat that I see is unauthorized access to a large target. In terms of, just real quickly, in terms of how I frame that up in terms of, the outcomes and measuring the outcomes and cost or whatever, in healthcare, you always start with patient safety. So outside of Primera in a healthcare organization, we would be talking very seriously about if this event happens, this is the impact on patient safety. That's job one. Then it goes into the cost avoidance. I mean, we kind of touched upon the fact that there's a lot of evidence out there of how much this actually costs in public disclosure. I can tell you that's the tip of the iceberg that an organization goes through to do the forensics, remediate, all that stuff that's underneath that iceberg. That's cost that comes out of your bottom line after you've paid taxes. So there's not many people out there that are projecting to have a data breach this year, and we're going to set aside 26, 28, 29 million to go take care of that breach. So that's all money that comes out of somewhere. And then a couple last things, abnormal churn. Within any industry, you have a normal turnover of customers, and in healthcare, it's, the patients, there's a normal churn of people that used to use your facility, now they don't. It bumps up a bit when you've had a data incident. So very public disclosure of a data incident causes an additional increase that you weren't counting on of people that don't use you anymore, they don't trust you. You got to earn that back. And last but not least, bad publicity. That's probably, one of the real throat punches is you are dragged around in the mud for a very long period of time. Fairly, unfairly, that's a debate, but there is really there's no victimology in the field of data breach. If you're the subject of a data breach, there's not a real rush to say, "Oh, poor organization that had that data breach." So, and that's just an editorial comment because, if somebody broke into your house and stole stuff, you wouldn't be on the front page as being negligent for not locking your door. But I won't go there.
Okay, expert in risk. What are your threats?
What are our threats, or the
We are on the threats section of threat, probability, and impact.
I was on taxonomy. Mainly it's been phishing. That's where they've gotten traction. And it's the I got to sort of say this out. You got to pay attention to the whole paragraph before you start judging it. But economists call people rational if they're rational to making money, right? School districts hire people based on their empathy, right? School district employees are not rational from an economics perspective. They're intelligent. They have degrees. And then they go and help the world, right? And that's great. But what that means is that you've got people who want to help everybody who knocks on their door, right? And so think about the phishing risk there, and the fact that our community is our shareholders. Imagine it this way. You're a corporation, and everybody in this city owns exactly one share of your stock. No one is allowed to own 2 shares of stock. I guess if you could vote your spouse, maybe you could do that. But our community is our partner, and also we have to be able to interact with them. So, for instance, can I just ban Dropbox? No, we're trying to mitigate that, and I could wax philosophical on the technical things we're doing there. But the fact that we are supposed to be embedded with our community means that we don't have sort of a blood-brain barrier between our community and us, and that makes phishing attacks really, really hard to get to the bottom of.
Actually, an interesting point. I mean, coming from an entity like Seattle Public Schools, yeah, you have a kind of a different landscape to work with. So let us jump ahead to probability. So we've discussed some threats. When I think about how to judge the likelihood that a threat will be realized, the way I do it is to look at the taxonomy of threat actors and make some judgments about their motivations, right? A hacktivist likely isn't going to steal money. Organized crime probably isn't going to melt your network. A nation state will do anything they want. Terrorists don't care either. That gives me a kind of a back of the envelope way to go, this is a high, medium, or low likelihood, and that's probably as accurate as you can get. How do you guys do it when you're thinking about how likely is it that this bad thing, this outcome will actually come to pass? I gave you like 2 weeks to think through this, Glenn.
So at the law firm, we look at a few things. First is the types of law we're involved with. Sometimes that drives some of our exposure. Political law is one of our larger practices, so we're concerned about some of the people we represent and that type of thing. Another side of our probability or our threat actors comes from intellectual property. That's another big practice area for us. China is very interested in US intellectual property. So that raises our threat from that corner. And then we look at the clients that we have. We're a technology-focused firm, so we deal with Google and those types. And they're very popular for a number of different reasons, either nation state for, again, intellectual property, or hacktivists that are unhappy with what Facebook is doing right now. So they don't want to go after Facebook. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on security, theoretically. You can argue that one way or another. Let's go after the law firm instead. They're probably a softer target, and we can use the law firm to get to the client, our client. So those are a couple of things we look at when we're determining probability.
Mm-hmm. Start with track record. So what kind of threats are you tracking, and what's coming through? So if you've got good monitoring systems, you're obviously going to start to track the statistics or the data from what you're actually seeing. So that helps build that first line. Second thing is when you have threat intelligence, we look at things like, well, first of all, we look at things, we look at to see if our names, on the dark web, or we've got intel out there in the dark web that says that somebody's thinking about us. So there's a lot of different indicators that you can work through and find everything from your name to people's names to numbers within code that maybe indicate that somebody's thinking about you. We also use to determine probability, or to at least increase or decrease what we're hearing about other industries. So like in my organization, we pay very close attention to the financial services, ISAC, Information Sharing Center, in addition to with the healthcare one. But it is amazing to me still how much the banking industry attacks are being reused against healthcare. And so when we see actors doing things in banking, we make sure we're ready, because we're probably a month or two down the road getting that same attack, which is just being recycled on the dark web, and it's pennies on the dollars for those attacks, and it's high profit. Going from there, it kind of comes down to some gut feel on like how you pivot on what you're, what kind of probability there is to happen in different threat actors. But it's dynamic.
I think we, one good news, bad part about having a small InfoSec team is we just talk stuff out. Like, we're both reading the newspaper. Like, I'll say it this way. I read InfoSec stuff when I don't want to really do my work, right? And so maybe you do too. And so that sort of feeds it, and we'll have discussions quite commonly, and that's great. I don't know if how well that would work when it scales to having 5 people or 20 people on the team, right? So it's great that we can do that, but I don't know if it helps if we staffed up. But in terms of relying on technology to sort of test assumptions or sort of ask what's there, one thing that K-12 has as a sector relatively good controls around is web browsing. The feds have said pretty clearly, you're going to look at all the web traffic and you're going to filter out this and this and this. What that means is we have relatively mature technology to look at web traffic, and we have no compunction about taking apart an SSL connection and looking inside of it. I'm the school district, and you're on our network, of course, right? So we probably lean on that speculatively to like, is this a problem? I don't know, and start looking at it there. And then conversely, we also try to block threats there as well, because everybody has to kind of go through that mechanism.
Okay, so here's what I heard. So using the taxonomy of threat actors and their motivations, open source intelligence, probably purchased threat intelligence, and just empirically, are there campaigns in progress? Another one that I use is if you were aligning your risk management with vulnerabilities that you've detected, is there a known exploit for a vulnerability? Because if the answer is no, the likelihood is probably going to go down that somebody will pop that, right? So I think we're all kind of aligned in the way we use this. Oh, do you remember what you want to say?
I think everybody's raised good points. No, what I want to add is just, one thing we're experimenting with in our organization is, I would say taking those conversations outside of the information security IT silo and having broader conversations across the business, because it's really interesting as we have those conversations with business owners. Hey, what do you think? What are you concerned about? What are you worried about a threat to your particular business line? They've given it a lot of thought, and they have very good insights as to what they think their probability is, including that. While it's again qualitative information you're putting into your model is very valuable from our standpoint, because there's some probabilities that we may not have anticipated that comes in from thinking of the business line. Yep. I'd also echo, seriously what Sean said about the ISAC and the idea of, when you're in between all those meetings that you have to go to every day, just thinking and doing research, right? Thinking and understanding what's happening across your industry is very, very important for your probability.
Open source intelligence. I like it. Okay. So we've talked about threats. We've talked about how we would estimate the likelihood of a threat being realized. Let's talk about how you calculate the impact or the consequence of what that would be. Now, to me, that's money, right? That's the only way that you want to report that. That becomes a little quantitative, and it ends up being more high, medium, low. But for those 3 bad outcomes that I like to package things, here's what you want to avoid. So unauthorized disclosure of records. Close your ears, Glenn. $150 a record, says Poneman. If you have 1 million records, you have $150 million in potential liability, right? That's the conversation you can have. Can I have $50,000 for controls around your $150 million in liability? And there's other empirically, we know how much money has been stolen through CEO impersonation, wire transfer fraud, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's ways to put bounds on all of this. So when you are figuring out the impact, okay, here's the thing that we want to reduce. What's your thought process going through that?
I mean, I think you've hit it well with financial. For almost every industry here, it's going to be financial. I think there are 2 elements to that. There's direct financial. So direct financial, where we may have to pay fines, where something is coming out of pocket directly. That's tangible. So I'm not going to slam Ponemon. I just think that everybody needs to be very critical of thinking about those numbers before they present them up. Yeah. And thinking about how this relates to us. So I want to be careful there. But that financial number is real. Companies will have insurance, and again, cybersecurity is part of the whole risk management strata. You're trying to prevent early on. You're trying to prevent things. Your organization most likely has a layer above that for if things go absolutely haywire, and you need to understand that, right? We're part of that. We want to ideally detect and contain it early, so we don't get in there. But for any industry, that can happen. The other part, which is Sean's touched on, Vern's touched on, is the reputational aspect. That is the soft, squishy, touchy-feely thing.
Put a number on that, yeah.
How do you put a number on the potential for somebody loses trust in you? Somebody loses trust in you as a health organization, as a consumer organization, as a professional service firm, anything. That's difficult. It's very tangible, and people are aware and concerned with it. But again, that's one of the careful ones to use. For a study that's interesting, if you're looking at numbers, I would suggest net diligence is an interesting study. And from my point of view, just as you're looking at various studies, the one thing about net diligence, which is interesting, is they actually go and partner with insurance companies. And so they're reporting on actual claims data. So meaning they're looking into what has been paid out as part of a breach and what's been consumed, be it on, you know, the typical detection, forensics, cost, notification, other things. But that's probably the most empirical data that's out there. Now, the only place I caution is if you think of an impact, right? An impact is not one line in the sand of here's $100, it's done. An impact is like a nice bell curve, but with a really long tail that plays out. Insurers understand impact in that early stage. Crisis costs, they're often called, right? Get forensic company A in, do notification, do whatever, handle things, patch things. The place that even net diligence and others will talk about that's very misunderstood is that tail. What happens, class action law, what happens down the line? That's potentially where the big costs come. But I think, you know, as we're assessing impact, it's probably more tangible to talk in that first bit, but the last bit is a nebulous piece.
Yeah.
But that's, again, part of your risk
Well,
management.
maybe Larry Poneman can study that.
So if I can just add on to what Glenn was saying, one of the ways I take the impact to my attorneys is if there's an intellectual property or a mergers and acquisition thing in the news, I'll take that to the attorney and say, well, this type of client has this type of work with us. If we lost that client last year, we billed X number of dollars for that client or from that client. So it ties into revenue. Exactly. So that kind of gets them to think about, oh, if I lost my client, how does that impact me? We're a large firm, but a firm is made up of a bunch of individual practices. And that's how they tend to think about what's going to happen to my book of business. So that's one area that we try to focus on.
Right. So the threat of you never becoming a partner, right? Right?
Right now, it's the partners that are thinking about that.
Okay.
The associates,
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts on how we parameterize impact?
Yeah, I think there's probably just some things that maybe marginal comments that because these guys hit all the high points. I mean, cybersecurity insurance is a big thing to look at because, you know, your premiums are going to change, although that's kind of speculative because the insurance industry has gotten better about pricing models with all the breaches happening and stuff. But rest assured, your premiums will change depending on how many incidents you have over a given year, and you renegotiate every year. The other one that I was thinking of as these gentlemen were talking about, I don't know if you remember when Yahoo was being sold or trying to be sold to Verizon, the price tag went down $4 billion when Yahoo disclosed. So that's not trivial. I guess that was about it. Yeah.
That's the impact of your company being devalued grossly. Yes.
Yeah. My thoughts were rambling a little bit because of, you know, it's tough to go in and your one data point is worst case scenario, this is what the price tag is going to be. So I need a new firewall. I'm exaggerating for effect, but the other side of the coin is, you know, there's some statistics out there, and the statistics are, you know, made for people who like to lie and sound like they know what they're talking about. But, you know, somebody once said that it costs about 8 times more in application development to bolt on security at the end. So if you want to use that model and say, look, if you're using security, either your continuous integration, continuous development, you know, the true DevSecOps, or just in your regular waterfall application security development model, if you're bringing security to the table early and often and building in the requirements, not minimizing them, but actually building them in, you're going to get to market a little bit faster, and you're going to reduce the cost of that development because you're going to come to me at the end of the day wanting something to be bolted on that's going to have to be retrofit, or I'm going to have to send you back to the design table, and it's going to cost you 8 times more. So there's a dollar amount there to put forward. But last but not least, the kind of the thing that there's also dollars to show that building in the security helps you get to different initiatives you're trying to get to safely. So like if you're going to the cloud, and you got your framework to do the risk assessment of putting data in the cloud. It's something you can now think about. Healthcare has been very slow for cloud adoption, and one of the chief reasons was the major cloud providers wouldn't sign business associate agreements. That logjam lifted, but there was still this reluctance because there was this perception that you put sensitive information in the cloud and you get less security somehow, and that's changing. But the bottom line is being able to show senior executives how you can drive higher revenue, do innovation by having the proper risk management process in place. Helps to get you kind of what you need.
Yeah, and so you're jumping ahead a little bit, or at least you're reading my mind, where we're going to talk about how you report this upwards and then use it in order to drive budget or move initiatives forward. And that sounded like a great technique there. Matt, you got any quick thoughts on impact? Impact to a school district is going to look different.
Back to the, a bunch of people with empathy, we're less likely to assign a dollar amount initially. We will eventually, yes, and we can count and whatnot, but it's more about the trust, with our community is probably the first issue. And K-12 is not comprehensively regulated. It's, it's hit or miss, it's, et cetera. And FERPA is a law, which is the primary privacy law in question, was written around a metaphor of paper. And so it's kind of squishy. But that's resulted and other elements of sort of works into that cyber insurance is slowly asking for more and more control validation. I'm seeing it at, it's a long road, but it's as if they're slowly like, maybe in 10 years, they'll be like the PCI of like, if you want to play this game, I want to see this control and this control and this control, et cetera. Because from my perspective, the cybersecurity industry is still trying to find out the right way to price this stuff, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I don't call it the cyber industry. I call it the cyber industrial complex. It's kind of where we're going. Okay. In our remaining time, which is not long, I do want to touch on how you report these issues upward. I think, Vern, you touched on, or maybe it was you, Glenn, touched on the point that there's always been risk management going on in organizations. They were focused on different things, it's business risk. And now we have a seat at this table, and we have to align with that kind of pre-existing knowledge, right? So here's Joe. Joe's with the city of Seattle. Risk to the city of Seattle is painting crosswalks wrong so that people get hit by cars and the city gets sued. That's what risk is to the city, all right? I mean, it's a metaphor, but that's actually true. And now the security group at Seattle is security, risk, and compliance, right? So they got to integrate with this. So tell me how you report these up to your board. What's that setting like? And how do you justify requests for budget based on these risk results? Or do you?
So one of the things that have built over time with the law firm, which this wasn't happening when I first got there. I was the first real focused security person in the organization. Getting in front of the leadership on a regular basis. There's a little bit of resistance initially, but when you start to have those business level conversations, if you walk in and, like you mentioned, talking about buffer overflows, that's going to be the last time you go meet with the leadership team. Yep. Because they don't want to hear from you anymore. If you go in and talk about risk, if you talk about potential impacts, how this could impact the business, cause a loss of a client or something like that, they want to hear from you more. Okay, how can I avoid that? Don't go back and talk about buffer overflows again. That's how you might avoid it. But from them, it's talking about phishing campaigns. How do we keep the attorneys thinking about these things at the forefront of their mind when they're also trying to practice law? They're trying to meet that filing deadline, and that phishing email pops into their inbox and they click on it. And now you're DLA Piper, who's been wiped out for 3 days. Yeah. So reporting at a level that they can understand and they're going to relate to is going to keep your seat at the table, in my opinion.
So I'll be brief. You get about 1 page worth of material to present to the board. So whatever you want to present, figure out how to get it on one page. First thing, understand the business, understand the core business you're in, and understand what you're presenting and how that either Sean touched on it and Vern touched on it really well. Understand how that presents a risk to revenue if it's realized, or understand how, great point by Sean, how it may enable the business. Because if you show that you're also coming in for how this can be a differentiator to some extent to realize business, that's a much different conversation than you're the department of no. And that really makes them want you at the table. Sean also touched on it, develop a consistent presentation. If you get that chance to be in front, having one graph 1 week or 1 quarter, a different graph a quarter later, they're going to continue to try to understand what are you showing. What I really liked about how you said, the threat, potential risk, you probably continue with that. And they've become literate and understand, okay, I'm seeing it again. Now I can start continuing to ask conversations. They understand it. So in your one page, kind of like get that consistent presentation. You may fumble around a little bit. That's okay, but figure out what it is. And then show whatever you're doing, whatever budget you're asking for, how that supports the business. Again, reducing risk to revenue or potentially enabling it. And the other thing that's powerful is figure out the mission of your company. And does this adhere to the mission? Because for Sean, it's protecting people's lives, right? If you're asking for money, it protects people's lives. People are listening, I would expect.
I think, so I would fill in the blanks or fill in the extra spaces. One of the things that I've found over time, not just in my own board presentations, but some of the things I've consulted on, you don't get a whole lot of time. So, be on point. And so, as we're kind of pointing out, that it's like, some of the messaging is the same thing, month over or quarter after quarter, culminating with more of an annual report. But you do have to shorthand a lot of things over time. And so the word that I use to really concentrate on is confidence. They want to have confidence in what you're doing. You need to have confidence in what you're presenting. And the worst possible thing you can do is try to spin it so that it sounds like everything's wonderful when it's not. So you have to be objective and confident. And it is kind of like just the facts. And the other thing that I do that I think is important is take it out of the metrics of what patch management looks like and, how many admin passwords we have out there and things like that. Just those operational lagging metrics they're eye-watering, and at the senior level, nobody really understands what that means. But they make for great graphs. The thing that I really concentrate on is, and I'm tying this back, Mike, I promise. It has to do with the risk management framework that you use. So if you're using NIST or you're using ISO 27001, or I actually use something called High Trust, which is it's very specific to the healthcare world, but it's nothing more than a kind of a repackaging and prescriptive implementation of NIST CSF. But I map everything to the NIST risk management framework around identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And for a bonus opportunity, we put govern in there as another category of how we map controls. So you take the high trust framework, you map it to the big categories of how we're managing risk, how you have your tools, techniques, and processes aligned, and I give the board a messaging around how we're doing. So my discretionary budget, if the threat changes, I pivot that discretionary budget and I show them how. And that's where you build that confidence that, things are in good hands from the management of the company. You don't want them to become cybersecurity experts because they're probably not. And if you get an opportunity to do some education with the board, that's great. But that's kind of, you want to be brief, not like me right now.
Which reminds me of a story. That's a joke about me making a segue. I would echo what everyone else said. It's you know what you're doing. You apply industry specific knowledge in the way that your audience understands. For school districts, I'll make a state level comment, maybe even a West Coast comment. And then it's back to that. Sure, everybody has one share in the business. Sort of, how does it impact the classroom? How does it impact teachers? And all the groups that are part of that. And that's how you translate it. But the macro comment I would make is that in Washington State, the state doesn't own or mandate a risk perspective to school districts. They don't. Now, if any other department of the state, or the central state office has a risk management office, et cetera, and they push out standards, and this is how we do stuff. School districts don't have that. The closest you get when you look at other school districts, not just Seattle's, how they manage risk. School districts think of risk, and this is hell, Oakland School District, in Cali or Tacoma. It's risk is really about managing insurance, and risk is about authorizing the board authorizing the superintendent to make financial decisions beyond $250,000, because that's the hook they have on to control costs, et cetera. But that is probably kind of a weakness in K-12 as a sector, is that we don't have an OSPI or a state perspective that's pushed onto us for a consistency and risk. We do it then ourselves.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to bring this to a close here. I don't know if anybody's got any questions. I do want to say that one thing you brought up, Sean, is the use of a framework to base your risk assessment around. And we've taken that NIST CSF and we've converted it from here's a framework that you should align with to here's a column for likelihood of a bad event occurring because the control is not in place, and what is the impact of that. So if you learned anything from here, you would be able to fill in that sheet probably in a couple of hours and do an actual risk assessment for your organization that passes muster. So I think you could just contact Sarah if you want a copy of that. Yeah. And so that should be kind of a handy tool that, again, if all of this made sense, that it will translate directly to using that tool. So before we break, anybody got any quick questions? And I mean, you got to have quick questions. April.
Conversation you're having. You should be having these conversations in advance. You should not be a stranger to the table, and you should have already built trust so that you can make the moves you need to make when you need to make them.
Does my board trust me? Oh. Other questions, sir?
You mentioned earlier on the reporting side in regards to the one page and understanding the risk to revenue. And I understand reporting and saying we reduced the risk from high to medium, but you also mentioned reporting on how you enable the business. And I hear that a lot. I was just kind of curious, how do you and your teams decide and then report on how you're enabling the business, not reducing risk?
That's so it ties in with the point that was just made by April. That's where you do some legwork. That's where when you have time between meetings, you're taking the time to have a phone conversation with a board member, with a partner, with, I don't know, somebody in a line of business to understand what's going on, how it works for them. And you may hear things like, again, if we could only get rid of this, if we could only stop doing it this way, we've got clients sitting in the wings. I'm manufacturing something very general here, but I guess it's having conversations outside of the security, outside of the IT silo with the business. And it goes along the lines of, if you get that chance to be in front of the board, having these conversations and bouncing these ideas with business people beforehand basically means that it's kind of been heard by the time it gets there and you've already vetted it out. I don't know if that's specific enough.
I have a specific thing. So increasingly, trust and privacy are becoming the currency of business, right? Apple, no FBI, we're not going to give you a back door. Facebook, yeah, we're selling all your stuff. Who do you trust, right? So security, privacy is becoming a competitive differentiator. And when you can use that in marketing and it actually gets you more business, it enables the business. And risk management feeds right into that. Did you want to say something, Vern?
Internally, a lot of those enabling the business happens at the business unit level before it actually gets up to the board. So if you're perceived as the Department of No, you're probably not enabling the business.
Yeah.
But oftentimes business units come with a solution. We need to do this. Well, have you considered these pieces of risk? Here's some things you could do to mitigate that. And so instead of saying, yeah, no, you're saying, here's a better way. Here's how you can do this. So that will go a long way to helping show you're adding that value.
Okay, I'm gonna let these guys go. Panelists, thank you very much. It's great to be with a bunch of 100-pound brains. Thanks everybody for coming. I hope you got something out of this, and we'll see you when we do this again.